Hello again. Just want to talk briefly about honey. What is honey and how do the bees produce it? So honey is about 80% natural sugars, mostly fructose and glucose. The proportions depend very much on which flowers the nectar came from. So that varies a lot, but it's basically 80% sugar and less than 20% water. In that state it's hygroscopic, which means that it attracts water out of the atmosphere by osmosis, I think. And so if you leave honey open to the atmosphere, it will absorb water from the air, the water content will increase, and eventually the honey will ferment. So in terms of honey in a jar, you need to keep the lid on the jar, but otherwise it lasts forever. In terms of honey in the hive, as soon as the bees have converted nectar into honey, they put a wax capping over it to prevent air getting into it to store it, so that it will store. So this hygroscopic action is why honey is a good wound dressing and why it kills bacteria. Because if bacteria get into honey, the honey sucks the water out of the cells of the bacteria and kills them. So that's how it's antibacterial, and that's why it's a good wound dressing. So how do the bees produce honey? They collect nectar from the flowers. Nectar is 60, 70, 80% water. The bees carry it back in their crop. The forager bee passes it to a nurse bee in the hive, and that nurse bee then takes the nectar and stores it in the hive and spreads it out inside the wax comb. And the two processes that the bees have to go through in converting the nectar to honey are, firstly, they adding enzymes. So there are enzymes in their saliva, in their crop. So the forager bee that brings it back in her crop is adding enzymes which break down the complex sugars into simple sugars. And then she passes it to another bee inside the hive, and that bee is also adding more enzymes. So there's adding enzymes, breaking down the sugars, and then the second part of the process is evaporating off the water. So they've got to convert nectar, which is 70 or 80% water, down to less than 20%. Typically honey is about 16, 17, maybe 18% water. Legally it has to be less than 20% for you to sell it as honey, and if it gets above 20%, then that's when it might ferment. So typically 16-17% water content. So those are the processes the bees are going through in converting nectar into honey, and you can see why warmth and ventilation are going to be important to them in the hive in order to evaporate off all that water from the nectar to concentrate it down to produce honey. Another point is that the nectar takes up a lot more space inside the hive than the eventual honey is, because there's so much more water. So as it's concentrated, they're packing it down and converting it down into honey. When it comes to harvesting honey, the fact that they put a wax capping on it when it's ripe is really useful to us, because that's what tells us it's ripe honey as opposed to nectar. So when we look at the stores in the hive, if they're capped over, we call it honey. If they're open and we can see the liquid, then it's nectar, and it's not yet finished, not yet processed. So in terms of considering whether you can harvest honey or not, the cells need to be capped, or at least the vast majority of most of them need to be capped, and then you can consider that ripe honey that's ready for harvesting. And how we actually remove the honey from the hive and process and harvest it, we can talk about later. But basically that's what the bees are doing in converting nectar to honey. So I think that's it for now. Thank you very much.